Hey game developers, and welcome to another Unity tutorial. You're with Bilal from Zenfinity.net, and in this one we're going to be learning how to use the player pref system from Unity. And we'll be setting up this settings manager here so that it saves the preferences that the player chooses. Now if you want to follow along with the same projects, go ahead and click in the top right. There's a card that'll let you download the starter project files. And it's also in the description below, as well as the complete project files. So this settings manager is actually from the game Rebound, which I released about a year ago, and it's actually released on Steam as well. So I think it's a plus that it's an actual real game. So this is the settings manager that is actually like pulled from the game but improved. So that's what the visuals are from. You can click the playlist if you want to check out how to make some of the parts out of Rebound. Or just follow along in this video now. And so to make our settings manager here actually do something, obviously we need to write a script. But before I even go into that, I want to go ahead and take a look at what this settings manager is here. So I'm going to hit the play button, and I'll show you. We have 3 sliders here. We have a toggle group with 3 toggles in it, and we have 2 toggles at the bottom here. So I'm not actually going to go over how to make all this, but I will quickly say what all the components are. Well, I'll go into them because I just mentioned what all of them are. So let's go ahead and look at our difficulty toggle group here. So we have this difficulty text, and let's see, I think it's in toggles. No, those are the bottom. Difficulty toggles, here we go. So we have a toggle group here, which just basically makes it so that when I click one of these, it turns off the other 2, just like a radio in HTML. Or if you don't know what that is, basically only one of these can be selected at a time. And so we have, faster and fastest as the 3 difficulties in Rebound. So, you pick one of those, and you can see each of these is a toggle with a text. So down here in for these volumes, obviously these are all just 3 different sliders. And they have a value between 0 and 1, and that's important to know because that is how the volume system is actually going to work. For an audio source, the value is 0 to 1. It's not 0 to 100 or anything like that. It's a float decimal number from 0 to 1. Okay, and so yeah, I can slide these down and say I put these over here, and I don't know, maybe I don't want Bloom on. But I do want tips on because I suck or something. So there we go. That's how the settings manager works. And so the problem is when I set all of these and I quit the game because I'm done playing, and then I come back, now my ears are being blasted by the music volume because I didn't actually make a player pref system so that these preferences would be stored. So that's a very irritating experience for the user, and so you definitely want to have a settings system where these settings are actually saved so you don't have to change them every single time. Imagine if your resolution started off at 680 by 480 and everybody's playing on a 1920 monitor. So that would be very irritating as well. So to actually get into the tutorial here, why don't we go ahead and start with making our settings manager script here. I'm going to actually open up Visual Studio now. I forgot to load it up. And I'll go hop into Unity, and I'll hit Create, and I'll hit C# Script. Okay, and this will be called Settings Manager. Okay, so our Settings Manager here is, of course, going to be a model behavior, so it's a component. And I'm going to go ahead and, ahead of time, attach it to our Settings window here. Okay, and what this is going to do is obviously store the player prefs and have references to all of these so that whenever we start the game we have our same settings. Okay, so let me go ahead and hop into our settings manager. I'll hit reload. Okay, and so this is here, and awesome. So why don't we get started, I guess, with making the constants here. So I'm going to start with our volume constants, so region player pref key constants, because player prefs are stored by a key and a value. The value is either a string, float, or integer, so nothing else can be stored. If you want to store something, it has to be translated to one of those 3 primitives. So let's go ahead and start with these volume constants, like I just said. So const string music volume pref. Oops. Pref. And if you're wondering why I'm making this all caps, it's because the constants in C# have a convention. Sorry, the convention for constants in C# is to write them in all caps with underscores. So that's something to keep in mind to make your code more readable. So here, this is just going to be music-volume. Okay, and then I'll paste this a couple times. This one's going to be voiceover, so VO, and this one will be SFX for sound effects. So let's change these keys here, as they will be overwritten otherwise, to sound volume and voice volume. Okay, so that's what we're going to store and grab our player prefs by, similar to a dictionary, but in storage. So let's go ahead and write private const string difficulty pref equals difficulty, which is of course the difficulty, or it was the difficulty in Rebound, and string tips pref equals tips, and this is whether or not our tutorial is on during the game. So in Rebound, little tips would hop up and tell you what the current enemy is going to do. So that's what that setting's for. Okay, and now we can finally have a bloom pref equals bloom. Okay, now before we continue, I want to be clear that this tutorial is strictly for setting up the settings manager and storing these values when the game starts. If you want to do something with those, then hopefully this video will give you the power to do so. If not, you'll understand the player pref system, and maybe some more extra research or tutorial videos can help you out with setting up the rest of it, like integrating it with your system and actually setting the audio source. But for now, we're not going to be doing that. So in this region here, I'm going to make another region that is all of our component references. And that means that it's basically going to be all of the Unity components here that we need to change the values of whenever we start the game. So let me do a region settings component references, and we'll do an end region here. Okay, and in here we're going to have the 3 sliders for the volume, and we're going to have 5 toggles. So let's do slider, oops, and then this is going to ask obviously for me to write using Unity engine.ui at the top. Now you can, if you're using Visual Studio, you can hit Control period and it'll pull this menu up, so you can click this and it'll add it at the top. But for clarification, I'm actually just going to retype it because I want to avoid any confusion here. So Unity engine.ui, and that's a namespace that will include this slider class, so now we can use that. Okay, so volume slider sound. And I'll copy from here. So music and voice. Okay, and I'm going to double space these. And we'll have a public toggle enable tips, a public toggle enable bloom, and this is all straightforward. It's just those components that we showed you earlier. So bear with me as we type all this boring stuff here. Fast difficulty, and we'll do faster and fastest difficulty. Okay, so that's all the components that we have. So we're going to be changing the preferences using those, and we do need to actually make an enum for difficulty. And if you don't know what an enum is, let me just show you really quick. Public enum difficulty, and we'll do fast, faster, and fastest. And this is kind of like declaring a type where, oh, sorry about that, where, let me actually quit out of this. Okay, so sorry. This is an enum. So an enum will basically let us have, any arbitrary number of types, but write it as, something that's more clear than a number. But these can all be translated to numbers. So fast is 0, 1, and 2. You can see if you hover over it actually in Visual Studio. But it's basically a way of making numbers look better. Okay, so you'll see how that kind of works in just a second here. So actually right here, we're going to have our private difficulty stored. And it's going to be current difficulty, and it will be equal to difficulty.fast by default. And so like you can see now, that's how we declare or that's how we store an enum value. So it looks like fast rather than storing 0 as our difficulty, as that just makes it, prettier and more descriptive. It's another code convention. Okay. Now, we have a lot of functions to write for making our preference storing a lot simpler here. So I'm going to write this function with 4 overloads, and it's basically just going to be for setting preferences here. So I'm going to make a region under our model behavior API here that's going to say region pref setters. And these are just going to make it a lot easier for us to store all of these values. So let's begin with a float. So private void set pref string key and float value. Okay, so obviously this is for storing a float, so I'll write player prefs dot set float key and value. Now the purpose of these overloads will be that instead of having to choose set float or set string or set int, we can just write set pref and put any sort of value here, because we're about to change the types in just a second. So let me copy and paste this a couple times. And so this will change to string. And so this will be set string. This one's going to be int. So set int. Okay. And the last one is actually going to be a Boolean. Now, that's interesting, right? Because I just said not long ago that you can't store a Boolean inside of player prefs. So what you have to do is actually translate it to an integer. Because if it's 0, then we can say it's false. If it's anything else, we can say it's true. So let's go ahead and do set int. And we need some way to translate this value to an int. The way that I do it is I write convert.toInt32 and value. Now the 32 is based on how much the integer can actually store inside of it. This is the default int when you write int here. You can see int32 right there, system.int32 is the default integer value. So our convert here is not recognized, so like we did before, we just need to write using system at the top. I'll scroll up and show you. It just inserted system at the top here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and scroll back down. And it looks like we're done with all of our set pref values. And I'm actually just going to write one get value here. So it's going to be private void Boolean actually get bool pref. Now the reason why I'm doing this is obviously so that we can just call this function instead of having to convert an integer to a Boolean whenever we want to pull a Boolean out of our player prefs. So let me show you how this is going to look to make it more clear. This is going to be the default value, as with player prefs, you can always have a default value when you're getting something out of it. So that means that if it doesn't exist inside of player prefs already, if it hasn't been written to the registry already, then you can get a default value. For example, if you're getting an integer, it'll be by default 1, but maybe you stored a 5 later on, and so it'll pull the 5 unless that 5 does not exist, in which case it'll return 1. So let's go ahead and write that to show you what I mean. So return convert.toBoolean, and we're going to get an int here. So player prefs get int key, and then if I put a comma here, you can see default value. See that in Visual Studio. You can actually, I'll zoom in a little bit. You can actually just write the default value here, default value. But the problem with that is, of course, I'm trying to get an integer, and by default, I'm trying to put in a Boolean. So of course, let's do convert.int to int32 default value, so that this will act kind of like a get request from the player prefs, where I can type in a default value. And by the way, when you put this equals sign here, that means that you don't have to actually pass the parameter, and if you don't, then the value will act as if it was just whatever is after the equals sign. So that means that if I don't put in default value, it'll always be true. Okay, that's a mouthful. And with that we're done with our getters and setters here. So we can move on to the more specific Unity code here. And basically that's going to be a lot of public functions for actually just putting inside of the Unity inspector here. So I'm going to begin with our difficulty section. I'll make one more region to make this organized. So region difficulty and region. And by the way, these regions are only a Visual Studio feature. I usually mention that at the beginning of every tutorial, but basically it's just a way for me to stay organized, and hopefully for you to stay organized as well, as code can get pretty long if you are deep into a game. So here, let's write public void on toggle fast difficulty, and this needs a Boolean state, as that's something that's going to be passed whenever this toggle is clicked. And actually, before I continue writing those other two, I'm going to write our set difficulty function, as we're going to need it anyway. So set difficulty, difficulty. Just said the same word 3 times. Okay, so in here, obviously we're going to write current difficulty equals difficulty. God, I'm saying difficulty so much. Difficulty. Okay, and so in there we want to write set pref, so that every time we set this, our difficulty preference is rewritten here. And we'll do int difficulty. Okay, so now we're all set with that function. And what we're going to do here is, so that if state is true, which means if we toggled on our fast difficulty, then we want to set our difficulty to difficulty dot fast boom. Okay, so let's do this for our faster and our fastest. I just went ahead and copied and pasted these. So faster and fastest, and we can just go ahead and write that at the ends here too. So these are going to be assigned to the toggles in the Unity inspector. I can actually show you right now. This, if I go to our scene view and I focus on our canvas, I'll zoom in. Faster, you can see on value changed here on the toggle, and you can add something, and you can pull settings window into there, and choose the function here by going to our settings manager, and then hit on toggle faster difficulty. So that's what we're going to do for the other two later, but that's just to make this visual for you. So let's go back to Visual Studio here. And yeah, these are all done. Just make sure I wrote everything correctly. And we're doing if state, of course, so that that's only what happens when the toggle is turned on. As if it's turned off, we don't want to do anything except let the difficulty get overwritten. Okay, now difficulty is done. So I'm going to fold all these over, and I'll minimize that. And we can just move on, I guess, to volume. And then after volume, we only have 2 toggles. So hopefully by now it's clear what player press is doing for us. If not, keep following along, and you will see the entire example. So here, let's see region, volume, and region. And ahead of time, I'll also make our Misc region, which is going to be for the tips and the bloom. So let's go ahead and in our volume have 3 functions here. So public void on change volume, on change sound volume. Okay. And I'll put some enters here, or new lines here. Okay. And we need to do this. Oh, actually, let me put single in here first. Single value. And, oh, sorry. And what a single is basically, it's like a float, but smaller, basically. So, some decimal number that's not whole, but, it doesn't take up that much memory in comparison to some of the other number types. So, onChange music volume and onChange voice volume. Okay. So now what I'll do is set pref, VO volume pref and value, and see how it's really simple when we use this set pref function. I don't actually need to change what's being written here other than what the key is. So on this is actually sound volume pref. Oh, actually it's SFX, sorry. SFX. Maybe I should have been more consistent with naming that, by the way. But yeah, these are those constants we wrote before, so we're storing our music as a key value pair here. So whenever we change the slider, it should store this based on our music constant. Okay, so that should be our volume region all set. And now we just need to do our Misc, which is basically some state toggles, kind of like our difficulty. So let me go ahead and copy 2 of these and just rename them, make it a lot faster. Okay, so let's see, public void on toggle tips, set prefs, oh, not difficulty, set pref, tips pref, and state. So now we can store a Boolean without having all our conversion code. Like I said, set pref makes it a lot easier. And, oh, let me copy that again, paste you here, and we'll change this to bloom pref, and this will be on toggle bloom, and perfect. Okay, so now these are all set, and note that they are public, so we can go ahead and apply all of these. I'm going to delete our update function and just format this really quick. But we can go ahead and actually assign these in the Unity editor in just a bit. But what I want to do is actually go through our start function first and ensure that when we start up the game, our values that are in the player prefs actually get pulled and stored, or they get applied to the settings menu, basically. So why don't we start with our difficulty here. So we'll do int difficulty is equal to player prefs dot get int difficulty pref, and int, oh, this is a cast actually, so I'm going to cast to an int here, difficulty dot fast. So that's going to turn into 0, as you can see here. That the purpose of casting it is just so that it's consistent with this get int function here, otherwise it would not work. Okay, so now we can do our current difficulty here. So let me see. So current difficulty equals difficulty dot, oh, sorry, difficulty of difficulty. Oops. So that's just casting this back to an enum after we pull it out of here. And the purpose of that is because obviously you can't store an enum inside of a player prefs like we said before. Okay, so now bool, let's make 3 booleans to find out like which difficulty this is. So is fast is equal to difficulty is equal to int. And actually we can check if current difficulty is equal to difficulty.fast. Now we don't need these parentheses here, but I'm putting them so that you can recognize that this is going to return a Boolean. So when we do this check, we don't need to just do it in if statements or else statements. We can do it anywhere we want, and it will return a Boolean that we can store in this value. So if these two are equal, then is fast is going to be true. Otherwise, it'll be false. Okay. So let's do this 3 more times for faster and fastest. So fastest and faster. And that's actually going to, whichever one is true, obviously, is going to be, the difficulty. So the reason we store 3 different Booleans is so that we can do fast difficulty dot is on is equal to is fast. And we can do this, obviously, for the other 2 as well. And it's as simple as that. Now our difficulties are going to be saved. Let's actually go ahead and visualize this before I bore you with writing the all the rest of it. So let's hop into Unity here, and I'll apply these on toggle fasters or on toggle difficulty functions here. So I'll drag the settings window, and I'll click the settings manager component. Oh, and we need to make sure that we're picking these functions under dynamic bool. Because if we don't, then it'll always return whatever we checked in the editor. So up here under dynamic bool, we want to go on toggle difficulty fast. And for faster, I'm going to make sure, it looks like since there's no checkbox here, that means that this is a dynamic bool. So let's go and see. Yep, it's under dynamic bool. And let's drag it one more time. And for fastest. Okay, and so to be clear, what dynamic bool means is that when it'll actually send into the parameters it'll pass a Boolean based on whether the toggle is active or not as an argument. So, and by the way, make sure all these are checked off by default so that they don't, because if they're on by default, then they will actually call whatever on value changed function is here. So then fast will be turned on every single time if that's on. So sorry, kind of a side note, but let's go ahead and see, if this works. Because yeah, we wrote it in our start function, and if we hit play, then all these are off. Oh, looks like we have. Oh yes, we need to drag our components here. So yeah, let's click on our settings window. Obviously, we need to drag these components. So I'm going to go ahead and start with our difficulties. So we'll put fast, faster, and fastest. Okay, so what should happen is fast should be enabled by default because it's grabbing that default value. Let me show you. It is grabbing, fast by default. That's what the second parameter is. You can see default value right there in the arguments list. So, okay, let's go to Unity again. And if I select fastest, now we've changed the difficulty to fastest. So if I hit play and quit the game, and I come back to our settings menu, fastest is still enabled. So what's happening here is when we set our preferences, they get stored into RAM immediately. But then once you quit, it saves it to disk. And there is another way to do that sooner, like you can call a function to save it to disk during the game. But oftentimes you can just leave it to Unity to do it. So once I quit, obviously it'll save to disk. I'll hit play, and now it pulled from the registry that my difficulty is on faster. Okay, so let's make it work for these volume sliders as well. So let's start with dragging our sliders, and then we'll go back to code afterward. So, so sound here, music volume here, and let's see, voice volume over here. Cool. And we'll just grab our tips and bloom as well, because that way we don't need to return. And let's go ahead and go back to our code here. And then we'll apply the functions in the inspector again. So let's see. Volume slider music dot value. There's a trend here you can see. Is just going to be equal to player prefs dot get float music volume pref and 1. So by default our volumes will be 1. So let's go ahead and copy this, and we'll do volume slider sound and voice. And the value is, of course, just that 0 to 1 value I showed you earlier. It will just move the slider over, and you'll see that in just a second. So this is SFX, and this is voiceover. Okay, and we are almost done here, so bear with me. Let me put our is-ons here, and this is not going to be the difficulty, but the tips and the enable bloom. Okay, and these will actually be equal to get bool pref, sorry. So get bool pref tips underscore pref, and by default that will pass true, so I'll write it in just to clarify. And I'll copy this, paste it, and instead of tips pref, it will be bloom pref. We are done with the start function, and actually I believe we're done with the entire settings manager. So that means that now we have a working settings manager system. We just need to go ahead and put our functions in it. So let's go to our music volume here, and we see our on value changed. I'll hit plus. I'll pick our settings window by dragging it over here, and we'll pick the settings manager class, and we'll do on change music volume. Now let's keep doing that for the other two here. Settings window, and settings manager, and sound volume, and we will also do it for the voice. Okay, and we'll have our tips here. So settings window, settings manager, and on toggle tips, and with bloom, let's go ahead and drag it for our final one, not the canvas. Okay, let's go ahead and drag this down. Okay, and on toggle bloom. Perfect. Okay, now let's go ahead and drag these to some arbitrary values. I hate when the music is loud, so I'll pull that down. I'll pull the sound down, and the voice can be like over here with the sound. Okay. I'm really good, so I'm going to pick fastest, and I will disable our tips and disable bloom because I'm on a toaster. And I'll close. I'll hit play, and there we go. It looks like most of these are what we want them to be, but our bloom and tips had something incorrect happen here. So why don't we go ahead and investigate what happened there. So, oh, and one thing we should keep in mind is these should be, is on should not be enabled actually here. That might be our issue. So let me go ahead and hit play again. Turn both of these off just to test. Let's see. Nope, that's not the issue. So settings window, we have them stored here. And let's go ahead and hop into our code. Oh, and maybe this default value is being pulled, but I doubt it. So let's remove those, and get pool pref. So these is on equals get pool pref, tips pref. And let's actually look at our pref setters here. Let's see if it even got set correctly. Or sorry, in our Misc. Set pref, tips pref state. Oh, and you know what's happening is these are actually not being turned off. So why don't we go ahead and delete this state here so that when these are turned off, that gets saved. We only want those for the difficulty because the difficulty is one difficulty at a time, but these can actually be on or off simultaneously. So if these get turned off, now we should see that happen here. So let's turn both of these off and see if that works correctly. And yeah, it looks like that was the issue. So just make sure that in our onToggle tips and onToggle bloom functions here, that we just set the pref to whatever the state is, no matter what. So I can enable bloom now and hit play. And now we have our correct system. And when we move things, they get saved and no issues. So whenever we want to access one of these functions, we just reference the settings manager or put them in a different function, or sorry, in a different script. Or they could be static values, for example, like if I wanted to store the sound, I could always store the sound whenever I change it in a static value. So then I could do settings manager.volume to reference it. And that way I could set the volume of an audio system. So that is actually going to be it for this tutorial. There's a working settings manager system. You just need to use the values by integrating them into your game. So yeah, I hope this helped out, and if it did, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more tutorials like this. Please tell me what else I can clarify, as I want to make these tutorials as good as they can be. They're supposed to clarify everything to make this process of developing something as streamlined as possible. Oh yeah, and if you want to make the actual settings manager here, if you want a tutorial on how to actually just configure where these sliders are and the layout of this settings manager, go ahead and leave a comment and tell me that you do want that tutorial. I didn't find it as necessary as the player prefs tutorial, but I'm willing to do that as well. So yeah, and with that said, actually there is a free ebook here that I want to give you in the top right. Go ahead and click that. It will tell you all the software and tools that you need to develop your first game. And yeah, actually, finally, there's just one last thing I want to show you, and that's a free sample video out of our course that there are 90% off coupons for in the description below. But yeah, click that card and you will see a free sample video out of it. Maybe get something out of it yourself too. So yeah, I will see you in the next video, and have a good one.